Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final session, the final webinar, I should say, of our Preserve Minnesota 2020 conference. A couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. Just a reminder that all participant microphones are muted for the webinar. We ask that you would please use the Q&A window for any questions that you have, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. And this meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be available via our website after we're done today. So you can look for that later this afternoon. And everyone who registered for the conference will receive an email soon with links to all of the recordings. And now I would like to hand it over to Kelly Gregg Johnson of the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office for introductions.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the State Historic Preservation Office, I'd like to welcome you to the sixth and final session of the 40th Annual Preserve Minnesota Conference. I hope everyone is safe and well. I'm Kelly Gregg Johnson, Environmental Review Specialist with the State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm speaking to you from Minneapolis in the homeland of the Dakota people. We'd like to know where everyone is joining us from and welcome you to acknowledge tribal communities, as Minnesota is also within the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe. So please use the chat feature to share that information. There's at least 13,000 years of American Indian history in Minnesota. Other Native nations with ancestral connections here include the Iowa, Ho-Chunk, Cheyenne, Cree, Lakota, and Assiniboine. We'd also love to hear if this is your first time joining a Preserve Minnesota conference. So again, please use the chat feature to let us know if you are a first-time attendee. If you were with us last year in St. Cloud, you may have filled out an online survey regarding the updating of Minnesota's preservation plan or voted for a preservation mascot. The intent was to conclude a year's worth of engagement at this year's conference and submit a draft plan to the National Park Service for final approval. Our timeline has now been modified and we have received a one-year extension, so there are still ways to engage in this process. A draft plan will be out for public comment in mid-2021. You can sign up for SHPO's Gov Delivery messaging by visiting our website to subscribe. We've all been adjusting to the global pandemic, and our virtual conference reflects those adjustments. While the SHPO team values the networking opportunities we have during our in-person events, we hope that our online series has allowed for greater access and participation during these past 3 weeks. Thank you for being a part of this virtual conference and joining us from your home or from wherever you are tuning in. We appreciate you taking the time to participate. With that, I would like to welcome our speakers for this morning's session. Ann Ketz, the CEO and Services Director of the 106 Group, and Naida Presley, recently retired Executive Director of the Aurora St. Anthony Neighborhood Development Corporation in St. Paul. Thanks to you both for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Well, greetings. And now, first of all, I want to say thank you to the State Preservation Department of Minnesota for inviting me to present to you the first St. Paul African American Historic and Cultural Context Study. And I'm looking forward to presenting in a short form the work that our organization was able to get funding for through the Minnesota Historic Society and the Legacy Funding, and also the St. Paul Foundation as well, to create and do the research and to hire this wonderful group, 106 Group, who my partner is today, Ann Ketz, to present this information to you. So again, thank you, and I look forward to our hour together. Okay, well, today we're just gonna kind of give you an overview. We'll talk about the why, our vision, the need. Then we'll talk about the how we actually put this project together. We'll talk about what is a context and what is not a context. We'll talk about the national perspective, and then talk about our next steps and let you know what we've been doing since the study was completed. Okay, first of all, the vision. As an African-American-led organization, and we have a strong historic presence in the historic Rondo community. And because of what happened to the Rondo neighborhood in terms of a destruction of a transportation project, destroying a predominantly African-American community, it became very apparent to myself as well as our board and our organization that our community, our African-American community was destroyed, and therefore a lot of our buildings, our events, our history, and our stories also were lost with that. So the first thing we wanted to do was protect our resources, and then to also talk about our stories, because if our stories aren't told, because many times they're left out of the narratives, then our history is lost forever. And therefore, then we be able to show that African Americans had a strong presence and to the success of not only our city of St. Paul, but the state and nationally. And then we looked at the vision. How could we use this context study to not only think about preserving our history and reclaiming some of our lost wealth, but also as another opportunity to leverage economic resources and possibilities, and not only how, but actually being a way that we could and that we can leverage economic opportunities. So a little bit of background. I kind of talked about the Rondo community, and that's our focal point. We're this cultural context study actually encompasses the entire St. Paul and the African American presence in St. Paul. But our focal, as I said, the stimulant that really makes this project urgent was because of the presence of the Rondo community. African Americans have been here more than 150 years here in St. Paul, but again, because of I-94, it's demolished a lot of our presence, our historical presence, and so we wanted to get that written down and get those stories and look at how we could protect those lost properties, and also to educate and to bring awareness to the presence and to the work of the African Americans in the history of St. Paul. So the need, of course, I talked a little bit about the need. The African community, period, has experienced significant losses in not only destruction through urban renewal, but also through our history not being told, or our buildings, properties, our economies being reserved. We lost a lot of those. We suffered a lot of losses. So the need is we wanted to make sure that our city had in their preservation plan cultural communities, and especially the African American community, as well as many of our ethnic communities that Kelly talked about, our Native American presence. So we wanted to make sure that the city's preservation plan included cultural communities. And then I think without this cultural context study, our African American history is definitely at risk. I already talked a little bit about how our narratives are being lost, how our presence is being lost. As I look again at the Rondo community, so many of our buildings are no longer there. So there's a sense of urgency that this cultural context study helped us begin to look at how we can come up with a preservation plan and to give kudos and acknowledge some of those lost events, places, buildings, and again, to preserve those stories.
So I'm going to touch briefly on how we went about the context work. So first, of course, we created the project team, which was driven, of course, by ASNDC, the NAIDA's group from the neighborhood. And we worked closely with Historic St. Paul, and particularly Carol Carey, who was also part of enabling receiving the funding. Our partner in the consultant team was Culture Brokers, Lisa Tabor, who may be known to some of you. Ramsey County, Noel Nix at that time was with Ramsey County, but as many of you know, is now with the mayor's office, and there were many others involved. But at the heart of this, there was an advisory group that was made up of members of the community that had special expertise. Either they had tremendous background knowledge of the history of the community or were active in seeking redevelopment opportunities and so forth. And then there was obviously the community itself that we'll talk more about in a little bit, about how we engaged with the community. So many of you know what a historic context is, but I want to just revisit this. So a historic context is a broad pattern of historical development in the community, and it may be represented by historic resources. So historic contexts, they provide the information that can be used to answer the question, what is the best way to preserve a certain property or historic district, and how do we go about that? So a thoughtfully written context provides a solid framework and a foundation for evaluating resources, developing interpretive stories, and making informed planning decisions. It's also foundational for any kind of preservation planning process. And it actually only started in the 1970s as a way of thinking about development in historic places and so forth. So for this context, we have a part where we're describing at a high level the history of the St. Paul's African American community and its development between 1837 and 1975. Research was conducted, of course, on broad themes such as important events, places, buildings, cultural values, and so forth. Then within these themes, the context addresses topics pertaining to African American experience in the community, such as migration, religious institutions, business and industry, arts and culture, education, politics, journalism, and of course, significant leaders and events. So it also provides a history of just significant time periods. So it identifies threats to the, resources that we're aware of. Certainly, of course, they include historical photos of significant figures or events, and describe additional research needs, because the context is not an exhaustive history. It's not a book on the history of the community. It's a foundational planning tool. The work that was done met the Secretary of the Interior's standards and guidelines for both archaeology and historic preservation, and also guidelines for preservation planning. So that's important that those foundational guidelines are followed. And so it obviously has to follow a very logical sequence for identification, evaluation, registration, treatment of properties, and so forth. So we didn't get into the full process, all those pieces, but again, it's laying the foundation for that. Now, it's not accidental, it's very intentional that this is called a historic and cultural context. And this is really important, I think, because cultural is really, it's all about people. It's getting beyond the documents and the archives. It's getting at oral histories. It's finding out what matters to a community. And it's considering places where events happened, not just buildings where famous people lived. So the methodology we used to develop the context is extended beyond the archival research to incorporate extensive community dialogue and input. So this most comprehensive approach was foundational for determining preservation priorities that are meaningful to the community, and we also address some of the inherent biases of what is and is not preserved in the archival record. And that is a very, very important dialogue to have when you're thinking about recommendations for influencing policy and institutional activities. The advisory group was made up of a dozen elders and other community leaders who were familiar with the African American history and culture in St. Paul, and they provided guidance for the project team. We also had some community workshops which generated additional content and provided recommendations for the context. In addition to ensuring that places and people and themes of importance were addressed, the workshop had participants steered the recommendations to include preserving and protecting community resources, collaborating and building community, educating, interpreting, and creating and influencing policy, and remedying the losses that had already happened. And just as an aside, I was very moved when a gentleman brought a youth group with him. So we tried to get the young people to contribute. They were very, very shy, but it was a wonderful way for them to not just learn about history through reading textbooks in class, but also be able to listen to elders and others in the community learn more about the community history that's in their backyard, that's very relevant to them.
And could I interrupt? I'm sorry, just for a second. Naida, could I ask that you mute your microphone, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Only for a few minutes, she'll be right back. So then, so these are just a few photos of the cultural context, some of the folks from the advisory group. We had some really terrific conversations and dialogue. And then, of course, some of the historic photos of different gatherings over time in specifically the Rondo community. So taking a look at a national perspective, there really is a growing call for nationwide for context based on themes, and in particular, ethnic communities where their histories and stories have been very underrepresented. And often histories are invisible and hidden. So this is very pertinent. Even when we were doing this a couple of years ago, it was very pertinent and a growing concern and issue. And of course, with the what we've been observing with social justice issues bubbling up to the top, the preservation community is becoming much more mindful of the importance of equity in preservation policy. It is not something that just happens accidentally. It has to be very intentional, very intentional. And then I just want to clarify what a context is not at this point. It is not a survey, not a detailed survey of the community. It is, or an inventory. It's also not a complete history of African Americans in St. Paul. There are various other materials, books, articles that have been written that are wonderful resources, and I'm sure many more will be written, and hopefully this is an impetus for that. But it's again a foundational planning tool for deciding what is most important in preservation and how to go about that process. So just to wrap up this portion of it, the St. Paul context itself has been made available to cultural, civic, and economic development organizations working to draw visitors interested in cultural heritage, as well as the HPC, for example, and the city and others who are more involved with policy making. Certainly the MHS has become involved and really embracing this document. And Amy's going to talk a little bit more about some of the grant sources that are available. And the context is actually available online. I'll provide that link in just a few moments. So I think what we'd like to do is move back to Naida, if you would like to talk a little bit about some of the next steps that happened since we completed the context study.
Yes, one of the important portions of the cultural context study, as Anne talked about, was this community process, and really including the voices, an eclectic group of community people in this process. And so the next portion of the presentation that I'll talk about is actually, these are community recommendations that came from those particular voices about what they saw should be part of this study, and then to really kind of guide us into the next steps. So the first one we talked about, preserve and protect, which really talks about how do we get the funding and the resources to continue to tell these stories, because we needed to still collect stories from our elders. So how do we get those resources to continue to preserve and protect our narratives, and to give kudos to our historic presence of the African American community, and then collaborate and build community. That was an important community recommendation. We know that we have to build more partnerships and more alliances with our city, with our state entities or organizations. And then the next one important is educate, to interpret and create. And that's another important one. Anne talked about our youth that we had at the one of our workshops. It was really important to let our youth know what the African Americans have done in our community and here in St. Paul, because they will be the bearers and the stewards of carrying on this history. So it's important to get our young people involved and to continue to interpret and educate what this work is all about. And then importantly is influence policy. I know we talked a little bit about this in our testing yesterday, some of the folk here on this webinar, but it's important to really think about how we influence our policy level, especially the local level, where we probably will have the most influence. So how do we work with our Historic Preservation Committee? How do we work commission? How do we work with the city in terms of getting, again, into their city's plan? And then we have to remedy those losses. Again, the African American community historically has suffered many, many losses through being enslaved, through being exploited through their labor, the Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow policies, and just in slavery in general. So, and then we look at the Rondo community and the communities throughout the nation that through urban renewal have destroyed whatever neighborhoods and wealth that a lot of African Americans have. So how do we remedy those losses? So that's an important piece of the community recommendations. And then again, I talked a little bit about leveraging local economies. So telling our history and highlighting the significance and the contributions of African Americans can actually be an economic driver, an economic engine. So we look at creating tourism or visitorship here in Minnesota, here in the city of St. Paul. We have cultural tourists that want to travel to different areas to get that cultural experience. And then not the last thing, but looking at cultivating leadership and accountability. Again, we have to continue to build leaders to carry on this work and to look at our policy people, our local governments, our state governments, and then being accountable in including our history and really looking at it being written by us and not by them. And then us also getting some of those resources that usually others get that don't trickle down to the communities and being part of the decision making as well. So we have to cultivate that leadership and accountability in the process, as our community talked about. And then included from those recommendations, this all ties to those recommendations. We look at the next steps and this cultural context, really sparking to increase our historic preservation commission to actually looking at preserving and designating neighborhoods or our history in communities. Then we looked at this as being a starting point and talked about it's not a complete inventory, it's not a complete survey. So this gives us the foundation to complete and to really look at doing that survey and doing that inventory, doing that reconnaissance study so that we actually can come up with a preservation plan. And then again, to increase the federal and state designation. We indeed do have some really local historic sites already that have the designation, but we've lost so many, and we would like to really recognize some of those lost historic sites. One historic site many of you may know is the Pilgrim Baptist Church that's been given the designation in our historic St. Paul community. And then again, this helps us develop partnerships. We put together, again, that's that leadership. We put together that leadership team or teams, different teams working on different portions or committees to, again, to really broaden this context study. And then again, this will help us address policy. We now have, it's written, it's in the format, it's in the structure of what the National Historic Register deems that the process was and deems that the context study is written. So now we have some foundation to actually move on some policy work, maybe around some policy work, to really create some intentional policies that will help us move forward. And then again, this will again help us increase awareness. That again is very important on all levels to increase the importance of African American presence and contributions to the city of St. Paul. So we look at this as helping to increase awareness as well. And then this study has not sat on the shelf. And we're really happy about that because many times when reports are done or studies are done, they sit on the shelf, but it's really been a piece of work that's been continued, has had continued use. So again, the context study was finalized in 2016. And then with the help of Christine, I don't know if she's on the WebEx, she helped us put together, and Noel put together a resolution to the Historic St. Paul Preservation Commission to get this adopted by the city and the Planning Commission in February of 2018. So now it's part of the comp plan, the city's comprehensive plan, and under the section of historic preservation. And not only just for the African American community, but it sets a credence for other cultural communities as well, to also be included in this cultural preservation plan. So we're really proud of the fact that this cultural context study has done that. And then lastly, but very important, in June of 2019, we won the American Association of State and Local History Award of Excellence, which is a national award that we competed with 50 other, they only choose 50 areas around the state to get this award. And I want to thank the 106 group, Ann's group, and her leadership in writing the proposal for them to consider our work here in St. Paul. And to us and to St. Paul and to the state, that is a very high prestigious recognition, because this organization really scrutinizes the work before they give this award. So we are very proud of this context study getting chosen for that 2019 award. And then again, I talked about how this is not sitting on the shelf, but it's being used by local residents, such as Frank White, who has recently just finished his book. It's been about maybe a couple years now, called They Play for the Love of the Game, The Untold Stories of Blacks in Minnesota Around Baseball. So he wrote his book around the Black baseball in the state, and especially in St. Paul, and especially those baseball players that came from St. Paul. And some of those baseball players had played with national teams as well. So I just got a call from him not too long ago. He said, this is what we got to add to the cultural context study. So he's using this document to help him write his next book, because he is actually working on his next book. And Dr. Bruce Corey, who was the former director of the St. Paul Planning Economic Development Department, used this as a framework to talk about the initiative that the city of St. Paul started coordinating around cultural destination areas. So really looking at the cultural communities across St. Paul to see how each cultural community or neighborhood could actually begin to build their capacity in terms of highlighting their neighborhoods, their cultural communities, and again, spur on development, and especially economic development. So Dr. Bruce Corey highlighted the St. Paul African American Historic Cultural Context Study as a framework, and as some foundational work, and as an inspiration for other cultural communities to also do one of these studies, again, to tell their narratives in their voice and written by those cultural ethnic communities. So we were really excited about this context study being part of that framework for the Cultural Destination Area Initiative of St. Paul. And then these are some of our priorities around historic preservation, and it meets the Historic Preservation Commission priorities too. So as I alluded to, we still need to further do a reconnaissance study and do the survey, and to harvest more elder stories, because those elder stories are so fascinating. They actually highlight the events, the places, the people that have really had some significant connections, not only here in St. Paul, but we've been involved in some national movements, the civil rights movement, the precursor to the Niagara movement, And so it's very important that we continue to look at this implementation plan in progress. And so we are trying to put together, build those collaborations, build those partnerships, and to look at creating a good, solid preservation plan. And then again, the surveys, we have to do the surveys, and we have to do continue to do those historic preservation, looking at those inventory lists and gathering that information, and then coming up with a designated area to look at those properties. What are those designated properties? And then part of the plan, we have to imagine, we have to do the imagining of not only what St. Paul could look like for the historic African-American community, but also looking at the future. So part of our imagining what Rondo could be, not only Rondo, but again, it's our focal area because that's where the predominantly African-Americans lived, is reconnect Rondo. They're talking about doing a Rondo land bridge over the freeway of I-94. And then our Rondo Arts and Cultural Business Heritage District, again, that's all part of developing and building the capacity of the cultural destination areas of the historic Rondo areas. And then the Center for Diverse Expression, this is being built right on Fisk and Concordia. Concordia is Old Rondo, or the historic Rondo Avenue, under the leadership of Marvin Anderson, where the commemorative plaza is, so that we can really reclaim some of our spaces and places and our events, and have our stories, our history being part of the St. Paul story. And down there to the left, that's a schematic of what the conversations have been, and some of the pre-work has been around what the Rondo Land Bridge could be. So actually, this is showing buildings and green space, businesses, cultural centers. So that imagining what Rondo could be is depicted in this picture of what the land bridge could be. And I guess, I don't know, Ann, or you both want to learn more, there's a link to the actual study in its entirety. So if you wish to learn more and to get the full breadth of the context study, there's the link provided there on this slide. And you could always contact Ann or myself. We'd be glad to talk about any further the context of study in and of itself. And then this is like one of our last slides. I just love this quote from Barack Obama, the former president of the United States. Change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the one we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Naida.
And I guess over to you, Amy.
I think we're sharing it back to Dawn and Kelly. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna. Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right. Great. Hi, everyone. This is Amy Spong. I'm the director of the State Historic Preservation Office, and we are going to jump into questions. So if you do have questions, you can type them in the Q&A or the chat. And there's a few of us SHPO staff people that are going to be watching for that. Kelly is here, and we have Michael Coop as well. But before we jump into questions, we're going to keep the slide up on your screen. These are a couple grant opportunities that are specifically targeted to these types of preservation planning studies and documents, including even inventory and National Register nominations, that we really wanted to highlight and point out. These are national programs. One is through the National Park Service through their underrepresented community grant program. That is eligible for state and tribal preservation offices, as well as certified local governments, which we have 45 preservation commissions in the state of Minnesota. And then the other one we wanted to highlight is the National Trust for Historic Preservation, their African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. So we're going to keep those up while questions are being asked and coming in. And the other two grant opportunities that are not on the screen that I also wanted to mention, Anne and Naida did mention the grant program that did fund the context study, which is the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund that comes through state legacy, through the legacy amendment from the state of Minnesota. And you can find more information about those legacy grants at the Minnesota Historical Society's webpage. And then another grant program is through our office, which is specifically geared toward certified local governments, those 45 heritage preservation commissions that I mentioned. We have an annual grant round, and we typically have about $100,000 annually to go to certified local governments for these types of planning studies, and which will help us meet Minnesota's preservation goals overall. So that will, pre-applications usually start in January or early February for that annual grant program. So I will hand it off to other SHPO staff here that are looking at the questions.
I'm actually not seeing any questions right now, but I have one. I'm not able to type it in, so I'm going to ask verbally to Anne and Naida both if they can comment on the community engagement component of the project, because I think it's fair to say that in the time you had this morning, it was impossible to convey the complexity of it and the extent to which the engagement process, played out. And I think it's probably fair to say that it was perhaps a different approach, maybe that, has been taken elsewhere. Anne is nodding a little bit. So I'm just curious if you can comment on that and provide a little bit broader, not to use an overused term, but broader context about it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Naida, do you want to go first? So can you unmute? Can you unmute? There we go.
Well, the community process was very intentional. And I know sometimes, and Anne may talk about it, that's when you do these studies, what I learned is that because of the guidelines or the structure or the governmental process or the National Park Service structure or the historic structure, it doesn't always include maybe a community process or voices from the community. But for us, that's where that cultural piece comes in. So we really wanted to include that piece. So I intentionally, or not the committee, I kind of intentionally handpicked some folk, but Anne kind of helped us lay out that community process that we should do, which was learning for us, because as we talked about that whole education and interpretation, many of us didn't know what a cultural context study was. I have to admit, I didn't until, through Noel and Carol, they talked about, we thought this is what would be the next thing that we should do in terms of preserving the African American history. And so we decided that we would include some of the leadership from the African American community, as well as different leadership from different, like looking at partners and allies. So we looked at some of the storytellers, some of the really good storytellers in the community, And I had a conversation with them and asked them to be a part of this advisory team so that we could make sure that even though we had to follow a certain structure and certain pieces had to be there, that there was going to be guidance and that we would create a sense of authenticity from the voices of the community. So the steering committee, we had leaders from like the NAACP, our churches, historians who are not only elder historians, but also historians by profession. So they were part of the team. And then just looking at different, as I said, partners, we had county people, we had our district councils, because they are important in terms of being the liaison between community and the city. So working with that steering committee. So once we had our committee picked, we sort of laid out our plan. So it was about a year-long plan that we included the steering committee, their meetings, and then the workshops with the broader community. And we tried to pick generations of age-wise people to be involved in the workshops so that we could actually make sure that we're looking at generations and gathering as many voices that we could for these workshops. So, and we actually sped up this process. We really would have liked to have had more time, but we did it for about over a year. We met and we had these workshops along the way and did these many presentations of the cultural context. And then we actually had the community editors, lack of a better word, community editors that included the steering committee, included people from the workshops to actually look at editing the draft and actually correcting information, because that's important too. That's where those stories come in from the people, is they actually authenticate if that address is correct or if did that event happen. Like we thought we wrote in the context study. So just doing that process and really looking at the intentional choices of the leadership or the steering committee or advisory committee, that was intentional work.
Mm-hmm.
Hope that answers your question.
Okay. Could I add just a few thoughts? Because I know some of the folks on the call here are consultants. One of the hardest things, I think, for us was there were so many stories, so many great ideas to take all those and do justice to them and put them into, again, a context framework. So without offending someone, that you couldn't include the specific history on this person or this place or this. So that was very challenging to do as a historian. And so as Naida said, having community editors was really important. And also right from the very, very beginning, again, having people understand what the goal of this specific stage was. So it didn't mean that these future stories, oral histories, research, survey weren't going to happen or weren't important. It's just this became foundational. The other thing that is really important is actually to not just have this led from the front, but from the community and grassroots. And that just takes a lot of time and effort. And that's why an organization like the district council that Naida led is so critical, because you need that institutional commitment to even get it going. And then I know we have a question here about momentum. That is a huge question about once you have this, how do you make a work with the partners that you've nurtured during the context process to really make this real and front and center in organizations where everybody's stretched very thin. And then the one last thing is, it's the 100-pound gorilla in the room. We did address overtly and intentionally that 106 Group is primarily a white employee company, a white-owned company. And so, and we are here to do a context about African Americans. And you have to be very upfront about that and be able to have some very hard conversations of where systemically or personally we're on the right track or where things are needing to change and what we can affect for change in this stage of the work and then future stages of the work. So with all the highlights of social injustice that are going on right now, we're becoming more aware of the need for that, but it cannot be overestimated that you, before as a consultant, you step into this or as an agency or organization that's predominantly white and has been the dominant group for years and centuries, they have to be ready to take that on and have an institutional commitment to do that.
Yes, there are a few questions coming in. I think you addressed one of them, Anne, but another one was, has historical archaeology been considered in this context?
Only in a very sort of in a high level. It's one of the methods of learning about the past, but we didn't really get into it in a lot of detail. It wasn't a priority for this study, but it's certainly something as we move forward. If as places in particular become identified, or places where you don't necessarily see the building, but a special event happened, or the remnants of the house might survive that could be studied, interpreted, become a destination on a cultural tour, then historical archaeology could become a key part of some of the next stages in the project.
And Christine's question too, I'll read it. What are your ideas about how to maintain and increase momentum regarding moving forward with recommendations from the context study?
Sorry, would you read that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. What are your ideas about how to maintain and increase momentum regarding moving forward with recommendations from the context study?
Well, hopefully I talked about how we're looking at reimagining the work, and what we begin to do is we formed what we're calling the Rondo Roundtable, which has been in existence. It's a collaboration of several of the organizations working on the on Rondo, different Rondo projects. So I think to really keep this enthusiasm going, we have to really continue to build that table, build that collaboration, build those partnerships, and to get and start to include more young people into the process, and get them excited about history, because we talked about that in our workshops. As Ann talked about, some of the young people we had at first, history, they couldn't quite connect, but when you begin to connect it to the exciting history that as African Americans have done, the individuals that live right in our own community that have been involved in national work, young people begin to light up and really begin to think about where they came from. So it's important for us to continue to follow some of those recommendations, the urgent pieces, again, to continue to get those stories and to keep people involved and to keep people identifying places and events and people and in the whole realm of this work. And so it's and then building that leadership team. And we're hoping to build this leadership cohort of people, again, that includes young people that will continue to go out and do outreach. We've got to do a lot of community involvement and a lot of talking to community, a lot of educating. So I just think continuing to engage people and continuing to build these collaborations and partnerships and working with our city and our county and our state preservation leaders and departments, that I think it will continue to build momentum and continue to be an exciting venture. And then with this Rondo Land Trust, I'll have to paraphrase Keith Baker, who's the manager of Reconnect Rondo. He describes the Rondo Land Bridge as being this shiny penny. It's really gained some excitement about, whoa, a land bridge over I-94. So it's really beginning to stir people's imagination, just about the possibility. So here's this little shiny penny. Everybody's getting excited about the land bridge. And so we could use that land bridge also to continue to talk about the context study and the next steps and keep people engaged, because there's something that this little shiny penny, everybody sees it. It's like a star. So I take his description in terms of utilizing this Rondo Land Bridge as maybe a way to get more resources, attention, and to keep people engaged.
Yeah, I think there's one other thing that's really important. The next stage in this work, in addition to the community work that NAID is doing in relation to all kinds of development activities around Rondo, is actually getting some survey and designations going. One of the things that instigated this originally was because a couple of properties were lost. One was unknowingly. It was sort of a bureaucratic challenge that happened, I understand, and the other one was a decision by HBC to actually approve the permit to demolish something. So it's really critical that that agencies that make decisions at the local level about what survives and what can be demolished, that there's good, solid information. And the only way that's going to happen is survey and inventory and designation. And so NAIDA and we have been trying to find grants and so forth, but I think the next logical grant is to try to get a legacy grant for the next step. And one of the ways the surveys could be done is certainly, it needs, again, the collaboration of making sure you've got people that can help follow Secretary of the Interior standards and SHPO guidelines and so forth. But if there's ways that we can bring in the community and young people to help with that survey, again, I think it's taking the idea that came from the foundation of this context and making it real in how we identify those properties and which ones get listed, and by being listed and designated increases the likelihood of them being protected. So I think there's a lot of parallel activities that need to happen and keep happening over the next few years.
Okay, there's a few that came in the chat too. This one was this great project. I'm wondering if you can point towards a city or place model where the indigenous cultural narrative has driven a context study and been a part of a city's preservation plan.
I'm assuming you're talking about Native Americans. I think I'm going to let Ann take that one.
I'm not aware specifically about an indigenous context in the sense of what we're talking about here, but more and more there are places and sites that are going above and beyond a normal regulatory type context as they're looking at interpretation or how communities, Native peoples, indigenous peoples are engaged in, again, these decisions about what's important and what not, and what's not important. So, for example, some of the work that's going on at Wakantipi now, the Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary is a classic example of that. of it started as a regulatory project because of federal funds 15 plus years ago now, and has evolved into something where the indigenous peoples are actually taking ownership of the place, the narrative, the preservation activities, so much. So that's certainly one example that comes to mind of it's been a remarkable story of the transition of a place from some initial early people realizing and underseeing that there's something hidden there, these Dakota narratives, Dakota sacred places that now are evolving into actually places that the Dakota people are managing and controlling those places, those stories, and so forth. So that's a really great opportunity to observe how that continues. And it's right in our backyard. It's right in St. Paul.
I'm going to interject because we're at the, top of the hour. And I know before we lose a few people, if there are a few more questions, I know too. And if there are some people that want to, maybe stay on for a few minutes to answer those questions. But I do, before we just close out, this is the last session of all of our 6 sessions, concluding our Preserve Minnesota conference. And I just want to thank everyone again, Anne and Naida, and all of the participants as well. Just one kind of last closing note is there will be an email going out to all of our registrants that will have all of the recordings of all 6 sessions. So you can go back and reference if you didn't get a chance to watch all of them. There's also going to be a survey as part of that email. And I would encourage everyone to please fill that survey out so we can learn how we can continue to improve upon this format and the topics and the sessions that we're providing for you all. So if you want to continue to go on for a few more minutes, and I'm sure people would appreciate having some of their questions answered as well, that'd be great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Happy to stay on if somebody wants to stay.
Okay, here's the next question is it possible that Concordia Street will be officially renamed Rondo Avenue? And was St. Anthony Avenue on the other side of I-94 originally named differently?
Well, the renaming Concordia back to Rondo has crossed my mind several times, more than once, trust me. So I really personally would like to look into that because I really do think it's important that if we could, to do that due diligence to get Rondo back renamed on Concordia. St. Anthony, I'm not going to tell my age, but it's been St. Anthony ever since I've been on this earth. Now, maybe some of the city or the state folk here might have some more information, but it's been St. Anthony as long as I can remember for all of my seasoned years here on this earth, but I'm not sure. I don't have the history on that. Maybe somebody else does. But as far as I know, St. Anthony has always been St. Anthony. And of course, when you think about Rondo, it was a 2-sided street, north and south, residential and a mixture of businesses. So it's kind of hard to think about. St. Anthony was a 2-sided street too. So I guess it kind of makes you think, well, was St. Anthony always there? Because it looks like it's part of Concordia, but actually, each of the streets had 2 sides. So, so I guess it's kind of in that way makes you think that St. Anthony could have been something else, named something else.
Another question is more about the context. So how long did the study take to complete?
It was about a year, wasn't it, Naida?
Yeah, it was about a year. From 2016, we got the funding, and we finally got it done in 2017. So it took a year, and it actually could have taken longer. As we talked about the community process, it's a valuable process, but if you're really going to do it right, it takes, you need to devote time to that process. So, and then again, just gathering the information, I can't, Ann can speak to that. I can imagine what it took to do the research around putting the context together. So I applaud Ann's group, the group of all the professionals that worked on this. So we did a faster process than we probably would have wanted, that we did do, but it would have been nice to have a longer time to add, really do some more community process, but it was rich. And I think we did a good job. And Ann's group did a good job at, facilitating the process. So even though it was it took a year, I think it was done well and it was good.
Good. Did you change the way you work to be more effective, Ann? And Naida, do you have some suggestions for others engaging in this process?
I'll let you go first, Ann.
Okay. I can't say we changed the way we work, because a big part of our approach to most studies, and certainly studies of this nature that represent underrepresented communities, hidden narratives, and so forth, it has to start with the community. It just has to. And so, yeah, I think where the key difference was, well, not even a difference. The key thing you have to focus on if you're as a consultant is making sure the work plan is structured in such a way that it's not just a checkbox exercise, go into a couple of meetings. The actual working with your advisory group and the client that's leading it, that's from the community, has to be very intentional, and you have to make sure that there's time put in. And generally that means if you're really, really invested, you invest personal time too. This isn't just billable time. You've really got to put your heart and soul into this to make it work.
And I want to ditto that what Ann said. Her group really put in some personal time, far beyond, like she said, billable hours. They really did. And I think just for suggestions, Ann talked about it. I probably didn't mention it, but we really have to think about the policy work in terms of getting more people of color trained in as professionals in this field. Again, I think it would be really great to do some intentional recruitment around getting more people of color involved in this type of work and getting trained. So I was really encouraged, and I'm not going to remember the discipline, but the University of Minnesota, it's how the city got one of their interns to do some more work on doing some more research and some more inventory and things around this context study. And if Christine is out here, maybe Amy even remembers the discipline, and you might too, from the University of Minnesota, where there's an area now, discipline now that talks about history and getting young people trained in this field more. It's not like directly connected to this kind of work, but it's a discipline where they could take those skills and transfer them into a field like this. And of course, listening to one of the instructors who we engaged with, who was working with the Minnesota Historical Society and the U to recruit these interns to do this work, She talked about the recruit. They had to step up their recruitment because they did not have very many people of color that were entering or signing up to take these courses. But one of the future groups that hadn't started, did have more people of color. So as part of her work, she was intentionally trying to recruit more people into this discipline so that there could be more people of color. And in that way, then, as Ann talked about, it's got to come from the community. It's got to, these narratives or this inventory or these context studies have to be told from those authentic voices, those community voices. So here's a way for Indigenous people or other people of color to actually be those consultants and get that certification, because she had to be a certified organization or professional to even do the context study that we did. We just couldn't hire any consultant. We actually had to have somebody that was certified. So those are some of the suggestions I would like to throw out there. And then Ann's group, you know, as we're thinking about the next steps in this recognizance study and the survey, and et cetera, we're actually thinking about setting aside dollars to have other people of color be involved in terms of doing some internship or apprenticeship. So that's a new way of thinking. They're willing to actually share some of the work and the resources to get some people of color, or in particular, if we were going to do our next steps, African-American people involved in learning these skills and understanding what the process is to get this certification.
And the program is the university. It's a Heritage Studies and Public History.
There you go.
I think that's a great resource, but also even if it just is a grant that goes straight to a consultant, I think it's really important that there is a very intentional way in the way the whole scope and work plan is structured to bring in young students. Maybe they get credit, maybe they get paid. However, the compensation works that's fair for everybody. To build capacity within the community for making it sustainable, not just having to bring in outside help, whether it's private or university. I think it's so important for programs to be sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
Another question: are there buildings or structures that the group has identified as priorities to preserve or restore as important to protecting Rondo's character and history?
Well, sadly, for the most part, a lot of our buildings are gone. So, but in light of that, doesn't mean we can't do some type of kiosk or some type of historical marker for buildings. But of course, as Ann said, we've got to really do that inventory to see, because it could be, but we really need to do that inventory to really find that out. Sad to say, Ann alluded to one of those buildings that got torn down was the S.E. Hall House that was on the register. And during the foreclosure crisis, it got to a category 3 and got torn down by the city, which really should have been preserved because it was on the National Historic Register. And now that building's gone. And another barbershop that was in our community, it was one of the last historic buildings that was there that had some significance to the African-American community, was Arts Barbershop. It got torn down again, vacant building, category 3. And when we found out it was going to be demolished, when I say we, it was the community members and or organizations, it was, too late. We couldn't save it, but that would have been a building that we may have wanted to get on the register to preserve that building, because barbershops played a very important role in the African American community, not only in the city of St. Paul, but nationally. It was where people got jobs, heard about jobs. It's where people hired other people, and it's where had a lot of community conversations on how to make decisions and what's going on in the world, politics, etc. So that's why it's really a sense of urgency to really get to this next step, to see what is still there, and to commemorate in some way or fashion those spaces and places or events that happen, and to preserve that history.
Yeah, and I think actually it's so important. So there are a handful that are already determined eligible or listed, but as we know, that doesn't necessarily protect them. I really think it's the more we can get designated, the more likely they'll be protected through the local government HPC permitting process. So if there's any of you have university students that are on this call that are looking for programs, projects, theses, things they can get credit even if they can't get paid for, send them to Naida or Christina at HPC, because there's a lot of work to do. And even if we just go one property at a time or a block at a time, anything is going to help, particularly if it's done within the context, again, of this foundational context. So it's logical building blocks. But I think students can be a great resource for some of that kind of designation work. And then also it means that newly designated properties are constantly being brought to commissioners so that they become increasingly aware. It's not just a study that was done 3 years ago. They're constantly being reminded. It's like, oh yeah, this one, and then we'll add this one, and what about this one? And so it just chip away at it. And hopefully get some big grants in the meantime, but I think we have to come at this in multiple directions.
Great. Well, thanks to you both. I think that was probably time and the last question we'll be able to address today, but we really appreciate you joining us today. Very interesting discussions.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you.
Naida. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.